Okay, this is part 11, the final part, thankfully, right? So this part, we're going to take a look at smooth muscle. Please remember my caveat. There are only 6 slides here. We've covered a lot in terms of modes of activation for skeletal muscle. There are going to be a significant number of questions regarding smooth muscle as well. It's just that we've already gone over the basics. All right. So, innervation of smooth muscle. So we really don't have an axonal terminal because we don't have a neuromuscular junction. Instead, what we have are these varicosities. So these innervating nerves will have these swellings that are called varicosities. They do the same thing. Action potential comes down. They release neurotransmitters. But the synaptic cleft is so wide, it is now called a diffuse junction. So synaptic cleft is really reserved for a neuromuscular junction with skeletal muscle. A diffuse junction, you know that you're talking about smooth muscle. Okay, so the sarcoplasmic reticulum is less developed than what we saw in skeletal muscle. So there's no paired terminal cisternae. And because of the arrangement of these muscle cells or muscle fibers, T-tubules are absent. We don't have to enhance that communication like we saw with skeletal muscle. So I'm going to tell you right now, calcium is still a final trigger. But if calcium is the final trigger, where does it come from if the SR is less developed? Well, there are going to be these infoldings called caveoli. So the plasma membrane of a smooth muscle cell will go like that. And then there's going to be all of this calcium in that caveoli. Let's see if I can do it without the pen doing that friggin' thing. Damn it. All right, I just have to go quick. So that in that pouch, there's going to be calcium in there. So what's going to happen is when there are channels and those channels open, since there's a high concentration of calcium in this calveoli, we'll still have that rapid influx. So calcium is still the final trigger, but this might seem a little bit confusing at first because there's no troponin complex. So calcium clearly then isn't going to bind to troponin and move tropomyosin out of the way. Okay, so what does calcium do? So what calcium is going to do is interact with calmodulin and myosin light chain kinase. I don't know if I've told you this or not, but I'm telling you now, kinases all do the same thing. I hate this pen. They all add a phosphate group. All the different kinases, they differ by what they add a phosphate group to. Okay? So we're going to go over this. I don't have an image of this though. So calcium binds to this structure called calmodulin, this protein. Calmodulin is then activated. Activated calmodulin will then activate that kinase, okay? That light chain kinase. So what that light chain kinase, that myosin light chain kinase is going to do is it's going to add a phosphate from ATP to that myosin head. Once that phosphate is on that myosin crossbridge, that myosin head, it can then bind to the active sites on actin. So think of it this way. In skeletal muscle, the head of myosin was already activated, waiting to bind to the active site of actin. And skeletal muscle just blocks that active site, and then we have to move it. In smooth muscle, that active site is already exposed. It's just that myosin crossbridge isn't in the correct configuration. So then that becomes what that focus has to be on. And this is the process. All right? All right, last thing with smooth muscle is going to be how it activates, how it responds to stretching. So, before I go over this, let me just say, why does stretching help with skeletal muscle? Because skeletal muscle has the ability that once its first response to stretching is it contracts. and it will eventually adapt to that new length over time. And that's why stretching will prevent injury. Because if you're reaching for something, or if you're stretching your muscle for the first time, and it can be pretty rapid, it can be pretty extensive during a sporting event. And if your muscle is not adapted to that new length, and you go and stretch it, and it forcibly contracts, that's where you can get some tears. Smooth muscle can't react that way. Okay? So smooth muscle will contract in response to stretch, but it does so only briefly. Then it adapts to the new length. And this new length still has the ability to contract. The reason why that's important is that it allows organs such as the stomach and bladder to temporarily store contents. It can be pretty messy and disgusting if smooth muscle responded like skeletal muscle. And that is it for the muscle chapter. And we're going to move on to the nervous system.